Peace, everyone. Welcome to Real Talk with Tehran and Roxana. In today's episode, we have the esteemed Professor Andrew Petersen joining us for an enlightening presentation on the archaeology of Islam in Britain. As we explore this captivating topic and field of research, Professor Petersen will not only shed light on the intricacies of Islamic archaeology in Britain, but also provide a compelling overview of its historical significance. Thank you for joining us once again, Professor Petersen, for a topic on Islam and archaeology.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me again. And I'd say I'm very pleased to talk about this project because this subject because it's something which I never really intended to get involved in, and it just started as it started really as a small paper I gave at the Institute of Archaeology. Chartered Institute for Archaeologists annual conference, and it's really just seeing if it was actually possible to talk about the archaeology of Islam in Britain, and so I just looked a little bit, and the more I looked, the more I found, basically, and then that grew into being an article, and then I gave a presentation, various other articles. So I should say I'm not really a specialist in this, although by nature it's kind of a general subject. But on the other hand, I like to talk about it because I think it's something for which there's certainly more research that can be carried out, and I think there's a lot of potential for this subject, and it's kind of multifaceted, and also it sort of bears directly on, I suppose, the experience of being British and the relationship with the Islamic world. And so I think that's why I think it's a subject worth talking about. Yeah.
And yeah, when I first came across your lecture on the topic, when I was looking at whatever lectures I could find of
Yeah.
yours, I really didn't pay too much attention to it just based on the title alone,
Yeah.
Archaeology of Islam in Britain.
Yeah.
From that, I kind of understood it to be like how the archaeology of Islam was studied in Britain. But
Yeah.
then
Yeah. Yeah.
later again, I went back and I rewatched it and I was like, oh, it's totally different than what I first assumed.
Yeah. Yeah.
For our listeners who might be unfamiliar with the intricacies of archaeology, could you just shed light on what the archaeology of Islam in Britain entails, along with its significance?
Okay. Yeah. So, um, first of all, because I suppose not most people have some sort of idea of archaeology, I should just say a little bit about that first, just to say, I mean, my perspective on archaeology in any case, I mean, archaeology is really the study of the past or things that have happened using material sources, which is actually objects, features in the ground, buildings, anything really, but not really looking directly at at written sources. I mean, you can include these, but it's really looking at like the material culture, and the way more and more I think of archaeology as really like forensics. It's really about, there is of course a branch of archaeology called forensic archaeology, and the idea of archaeology is to find clues about the past, about what happened in history in the past, and really to try and establish, I was going to say the truth, like in a court of law, but obviously we know there's contested views, just as there are in court contested views of the past. And archaeology is a way of looking at this without by looking at the material culture, by the remains. You're not looking at people's opinions from the past, or you're actually looking at directly at what there is. So the drawbacks of using archaeology are sometimes the material remains, the traces, that they can't, sometimes there aren't many. It's quite hard to find things, and you've really got to make do with what you actually find. Sometimes you're lucky, you find a lot of material. Sometimes you don't really find anything at all. And again, it's like forensics. If you're going to a crime scene, for example, you look for whatever remains you can get. And I see archaeology in general as like that. You're really trying to interpret what you see. So in that sense, archaeology can be seen as a type of science. I mean, you can also see it as a humanities subject. But the way I think it should be approached is using whatever evidence you can to establish certain facts. And the other thing I should make clear in my approach to archaeology, I think you should always make a distinction between things which you can say for definite. Let's say this we know is a cup or a mug. We know this, and we can feel it, we can touch it, and that's something which is kind of truthful, indisputable. But then the significance of the cup, that can be something else, and that can kind of be cultural and something you can kind of argue about. But there's certain things which are, I suppose, self-evident. So archaeology does both. It looks at actual things which you can establish, concrete things which you can touch. And you should always, in archaeology, you should always present your findings, your evidence first, and then any interpretations, you kind of work on that. You develop those from that, but you must keep them separate so other people can interpret the evidence. So that's just my view of archaeology in general. Now, the archaeology of Islam in Britain, or the name is sort of quite difficult, the title, but so yeah, maybe we should think of it in a different way. But I suppose the idea is looking for evidence of maybe Muslims living in Britain, Muslim contact with Britain, the influence of Islamic culture, and really just how the Islamic world has influenced Britain, how we've had contacts with the Islamic world, and how that may actually have had some impact really on the environment that we live in, on the culture that we live in. So the built environment, the types of food we eat, all of these sort of things, and looking for the deep roots of that, how far it goes back into the past. And just one thing, of course, and this goes back to why I'm interested in Islam in archaeologically as well in general, is one of the interesting things about the Muslim religion, Islamic culture, is that unlike it has a definite beginning. We know that it began in what we call the 7th century. So we know it's got in terms of a culture, something which has physical manifestations which you can look at. It sort of began within historical times, and so it's something which we can really trace the impact and growth of this culture. So that's like my introduction, I suppose.
Okay. And I would have never thought that that an Islamic presence was in the UK or in Britain for so long. I would have thought that it was only of recent times, and that the influence has only kind of gone one way, with Britain having influenced the Islamic world. It's only since watching your presentation did I start to have an understanding that, hey, well, maybe there was influence coming from the other direction, and not much so, not as of recent times, but from way back, even not too long after the inception of Islam or the advent of Islam.
Yeah, well, that's good. Yeah, I mean, and that's what I found quite compelling about this subject. Once I started looking at it, and then you see there are little bits of information, and yeah, and it does really go way back to near the beginnings of Islam, and so, which I think is interesting, sort of kind of culturally, because it means that British culture, because I suppose, the island of Britain goes back, into deep prehistoric times, but I'd say British culture, which people can kind of identify with and people feel they have links with, I suppose it really dates to after the Roman time, goes back. I mean, I'm from Wales, which is slightly different, but within England, it goes back to kind of the Anglo-Saxon period. So that formative period is actually the same as kind of the formative period of
Islam.
Muslim culture, which is, I think, significant.
Definitely.
In terms of you mentioned some of the sort of challenges that are involved in archaeological research,
Yeah.
Such as sort of preservation and excavation and things like that.
Yeah.
Are there any specific challenges that are particular to the UK and what you found when trying to uncover Islamic artifacts or sites in Britain?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think yeah. First, I'd say something a little bit about the way archaeology and archaeologists work in Britain. First of all, I'd say within Britain, archaeologists in general, you know, I can't speak for everybody, but in general, archaeologists are curious. It's curiosity which gets people involved. They kind of want to know. So sort of within archaeology, I'd say there would be a very sort of positive view of looking at anything really, anything from the past, but in particular something interesting like this. So that's one thing. But then the other thing you've got is that I suppose a lot of archaeologists, not all, because a lot of archaeologists, British archaeologists work abroad, have worked abroad, but most archaeologists working in Britain are kind of unfamiliar with, let's say, Islamic Muslim culture, particularly from the Middle East. They're unfamiliar with the types of things you might find, and they're very focused on, obviously, on what you would normally find in Britain. So one of the problems, I'd say, is unfamiliarity. And for example, a long time ago, when I was working for the Museum of London, and I was working in southwest London on the site of Merton Priory, which is one of the monasteries which was destroyed by, or dismantled by Henry VIII to build a palace somewhere else. But we're excavating that site, and we found lots of oyster shells, which is interesting. So monks were eating a lot of oysters. And we also found so 12th, 13th century, 1200s pottery from this period, which British pottery, which is like lead glazed. I mean, which means it's sort of green. It's made of the fabric. The pottery is like flower pots. It's like terracotta, and it's basically it's okay. It's adequate, and it's glazed, but it all looks quite similar. Sometimes the decoration is stamped on there, so there's a bit of relief decoration, but it all looks kind of green and a bit muddy, let's say. And then when I was working there, I found a very small piece of bright blue, turquoise blue pottery, which in fact wasn't earthenware, is actually fritware, which is a type of and because I was there at the site, I think a lot of people would have thrown it away. They wouldn't have recognized it, but I recognized it because I'd already worked in the Middle East as a piece of fritware from Raqqa in Syria. So there's actually something I actually recognize that, and I suspect that the fact that I recognized that meant that it was kind of recorded. But in general, within archaeology, the only pottery that you weigh pottery maybe, but the only pottery that you study in detail is if something that's got a rim or a handle on it. So this wouldn't have come under that category. And so I think it might have just been overlooked. So one of the things is it's unexpected, so it's kind of often overlooked when people are digging. And then within the literature, most archaeology in Britain now, the vast majority of archaeology is carried out doing things like when you're building major infrastructure like HS2, or what you're doing in a lot of developments in London and in big cities. And so there's a vast amount of what's called grey literature produced, which is like not exactly published, but it's available in public. So, but that's the problem with that. It's good, it's a record, but it's not necessarily looked at. So I suspect, and this would be an interesting research project for somebody, I suspect there's quite a lot of Islamic material from the Middle East and elsewhere that's found its way and been recorded, but hasn't found its way into the well-publicized literature, the journals and things like that. So I think so it's overlooked both in terms of when it's found, but also in terms of the wider literature. So those are the main challenges, I'd say. Yeah.
Well, what was it about this particular I don't want to say earthenware or
Yeah, yeah,
ceramic,
yeah, yeah.
but the items that you found, what was it
Yeah.
about them that made them stand out to you to where you
Well,
want to
for,
investigate them
for,
further?
for me, if you can just imagine standing in a wet, muddy field in southwest London, most of what we saw was kind of sort of variations of brown color. And so you find something that's kind of, I'm just trying to think, but something that's kind of quite, no, that's not very good, but something that's just quite a bright color like that, bright blue, is kind of unusual. And blue as a color is pretty unusual actually in medieval times in Britain. So this bright blue was immediately stood out. And as I say, I think a lot of people, if they'd found it, a lot other archaeologists, they would have thought, oh, this is just must be modern because it just doesn't look like medieval material.
Mm.
So I'd say it's that, and also the fabric, which is like the actual what it's made of, was white instead of orange or black. So it's bright white, and it's. I mean, I didn't break it, but I know it's quite easy to break, and it's so this is a composite. It's not made. It's made from a special type of clay, and it's mostly made out of, it's similar to glass basically. It's got a lot of silicon in it, and it's very similar to glass, which means the glaze sticks to it very well. So it's almost like a type of glass, but it's special chemical properties which were seem to have been invented in Iran in the 12th century. So this is like a new technology that was invented. And I mean, one of the things is one of the interesting things in Islamic archaeology is, or that's noticeable, is that really in the Middle East, in the Islamic world, a lot of new technologies were invented for making pottery. I mean, it's really most of the things like lusterware, or a lot of things which only came into Britain in big numbers in the 19th century, really started in quite early in the Islamic world.
Wow.
Yeah.
And without further ado, you have a presentation for us that
Yeah.
our audience can also see a lot of the objects and other archaeological material that was found in the UK that came from the Islamic world or was inspired by the Islamic world in many cases.
Okay, good. Right. So I'll just so I do need to share screen, don't I? So this is the so-called Offers dinar. So this is currently in the British Museum. And as you can see, it's made of gold. It's a dinar, gold coin, and it's got inscriptions on it in 2 different languages. So you can see around the edge on both sides, it's got it states that this is a coin of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur and is minted in 774 AD. And so that's in Arabic around the edge and also on the front there. But you can also see written upside down, it says Offa Rex, which is Latin for King Offa. So this coin was actually found. It wasn't actually excavated in Britain. It was actually found. It was bought in Italy in the 19th century, and was donated to the British Museum. But it's of interest because in terms of date, the date is correct. But the interpretation of this coin is kind of quite difficult. I should say at this point, just by way of context, and I'll show you a map in a minute, is that gold dinars like this, well, not with the name of Offa on them, but gold dinars have also been found elsewhere in Britain from the same period, from the 8th century.
And are those copies as well, or
no, they're genuine dinars, real dinars, and they've been so without the name of Offa on them. These are pure, real coins, and these have been found in London, Oxford, Dorset, and Sussex, and I'll show you that in a map in a minute. So, by way of context, gold coins, dinars, were making their way to Britain during this period. And as I think we mentioned when we were talking about this before, some people have seen these coins and said this is evidence that that maybe that Offa was Muslim or converted to Islam. And although that's an intriguing idea and in some ways almost possible, I mean, I can see, because Anglo-Saxon Britain, you know, is just emerging out of, let's say, the Dark Ages or post-Roman period. And the Anglo-Saxons, when they came to Britain initially, were pagan, so they could have. But one of the interesting things, and I think I'll try and bring this out, is that the Anglo-Saxons, even though they had contact, maybe not at first hand with the Islamic world, they, from their beginnings, there's a lot of Christian influence there. So Offa, for example, King Offa was he had close connections with the church, and also and also we know he minted his own coins. So just by way of context, I'll give you, because for many people, I mean, archaeologists are very familiar with this. For many people, they're not quite sure what Mercia is and what being king of Mercia. Yeah. So Offa was king. He was king of Mercia. He's the most important king in Britain at the time. But Mercia, first of all, it wasn't all of Britain, and also it wasn't the main kingdom in Britain for the whole of the Anglo-Saxon period. But for a period, it was. And here you can see a map of Mercia with on the left-hand side. The other thing that Offa's famous for, of course, is building Offa's Dyke, which is like Hadrian's Wall, which you may have heard of. But this is a wall separating England from what became Wales. So in a sense, Offa created Wales, in a sense, because Wales was just simply the bit of Britain that hadn't been conquered by the Anglo-Saxons, and he found them problematic. And we think this is what the idea of this dyke or this wall with Wales was. And then you'll also notice on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got a penny of King Offa. So it says Offa Rex, King Offa. So what we know of Offa is that he was king of Mercia, which was this kingdom within Britain, which lasted from about 527 AD to about 879. So for about 300 years, and this is one of the major kingdom of England, I suppose you'd say. It had a mobile capital. At one stage, Mercia even included London, but London wasn't one of its capitals. Its capital seemed to have been Tamworth and Repton. So it's really based in the West Midlands. So that's kind of a background to Offa. And as I said, we also know he appointed bishops. So he was very much involved with the church. And all of this tends to say that he probably wasn't Muslim. And the numismatists, the coin specialists, say that the coin of Offa, which we saw here, is probably a copy of a dinar, Al-Mansur's dinar. Al-Mansur, incidentally, as you probably know, is the caliph who founded Baghdad. But they said this is a copy of an Abbasid dinar made specifically because to do with it. Ironically, this is because Offa wanted to negotiate with the Pope in Rome, and he needed to pay them some money in order to get recognition of his church. So at that stage, Islamic currency, Muslim currency, the gold dinar was like the dollar is today, I suppose. And so that was the recognized currency. So we think, and this is how it got to Italy, that it was actually part of a payment sent to Italy by Offa. And the only currency that the Pope would accept from Offa was probably gold, with Abbasid gold, Islamic gold, which is interesting, I think.
So him striking Arabic letters on there was to give it legitimacy.
Yeah, to give it legitimacy, because otherwise, which is quite interesting the Pope wouldn't have accepted it, which is kind of strange. But it says something a little bit about the world you're living in the 8th century, when, yeah, Baghdad had just been founded, the biggest city in the world at the time, and one of the biggest medieval cities anywhere, cosmopolitan. So really, at that time, the center of gravity in the world was really in Baghdad, in the Islamic world. So yeah.
Could
So
there have been more of these minted coins in that we only found maybe one of them? Could there have been a whole collection of that was sent over to the Pope as
yeah, the numismatist who studied them, I mean, they've been studied by a few coin specialists, as tracked down, and yeah, this would have been one of a number of these dinars minted by King Offa to pay the Pope. There was a specific amount that was required, and only one of them has surfaced. I mean, as an archaeologist, we're very aware of the fact that gold as a currency, it survives rarely in this form as a coin, because people tend to melt it down and kind of reuse it in other things. So there probably were lots more, but only one that we know of that's come to light. So the other ones were probably reused in jewelry or remade into other coins later on. Or perhaps one other possibility, perhaps they're in the Vatican somewhere.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, I was just going to say one further thing just about Mercia. I mean, this is just to establish again the context. You can see this is what would have been a high cross in Wolverhampton, and this is we're not sure of the date of this, but it's between probably 850 and 950, and you can see it standing in the churchyard. So this is, but so it would have formed the base of a cross, which you can see on the left-hand side. But in the middle, you can see a drawing of the decoration, and you could say some of this decoration kind of looks Islamic. Now, the reason for that is because it has a few sort of kind of motifs, but I think a better description, and what most people agree, is that this is really a Mediterranean type of decoration repertoire, and so at that stage you would have had a number of decorative schemes which are used both in the Islamic world, in the Byzantine world, that's the East Roman world, and also in the Western world. So this is kind of a common Mediterranean type of decoration which is used. But again, this is from Mercia, so it shows the kind of artistic context of the coins as well, that there was, people very much looked to the Mediterranean as a center of civilization at that stage, and their center of where they'd get their artistic inspiration.
Yeah, because I wanted to say that looking at the designs from the previous slide, it looks like the Zals on there, and it reminds me of what I've seen in Umayyad palaces where they the Zals located.
Yeah. That's what strikes me as well. And I mean, I was just looking at some articles today just about the cross, and looking about discussions. And what's interesting is, and this is where this goes a bit to do with what I was saying earlier about with archaeology. One of the problems is you can have some evidence, but you've also got a lot of material that's missing, and the interpretation can be difficult. So, for example, for this piece of stone with the carving on it, the date of it is, we don't actually know the date. There's no inscription. There's no actual writing on there, and then the date for this is purely done on the style of the decoration. So at one stage, people thought this dated from the 11th century, from after the Norman conquest, and then some people have dated it earlier. So yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting, and I'd say, again, like I was saying about people going through literature, this is something that could possibly be studied a bit more, because for me, I'm not a specialist on Anglo-Saxon art, but for me, yeah, I think there are a lot of kind of similarities here, and it's something that's worth thinking about. Yes, definitely. So yeah, so this is going back to coins again, and this is just looking at, I think there's probably more by now because I did this work quite a long time ago, but here's just some examples which I found with not a particularly deep look at the archaeological literature, but just showing the location, the find spots of Islamic coins from around Britain. So, and I think we've actually got some in Scotland as well, but they haven't put them on. And so this is Britain, and I also include Britain and Ireland in this. And I'd say one of the interesting things, and one of the things that's noticeable really, is that places where you get Islamic coins are mostly within the area of what we were Viking settlement, basically. And so within Britain, that's what we call the Danelaw. So that's based around York, I suppose, York and eastern England, with occasional finds elsewhere. And the location of those other places, they're also very Scandinavian. So Dublin was a Viking city. It's called Hiberno Norse. And also the same with Bangor in North Wales. So the finds of medieval Islamic coins is really very much associated with Viking settlement. So when I was talking earlier about Offa, who was an Anglo-Saxon, so the Anglo-Saxons seem to have been pagan originally, but they quite quickly adopted Roman ways, and which included Christianity. But the Vikings are interesting because if you go to Scandinavia, and I'm talking about, well, obviously Sweden has got the biggest, really huge numbers of Islamic coins, vast numbers of Islamic coins. And
numbering more than found in the UK.
Yeah, 150,000, like vast numbers. And like I'd say possibly uncountable in the sense that there's still more being found. The island of Gotland, just off the east coast of Sweden, has got huge numbers. But it's not just coins; it's all sorts of things. So we have other influences, but the most famous probably is a ring from Mercia, which is a Viking site, and possibly one of the first Viking, something beyond a village, so we could call it a city or a town, and that's outside Stockholm. And there's a ring there which is a gem which is inscribed with Allah on it, and this is quite Mercia incident. This ring was excavated about 100 years ago. The Swedes spend a lot of time on their excavations. They're still excavating the site, but it's interesting. They found Islamic coins there, but also this ring, which again is kind of interesting. But yeah, certainly there's a lot of coinage, Islamic coinage within Scandinavia, and that includes also in Russia. And we think that was probably to do with the Scandinavians trading with the Islamic world, and the trade was probably slaves, probably from Central Europe. I mean, that's the most generally accepted sort of thing. And it's been argued that a lot of the depopulation of, say, Belarus and is because a large numbers of people were taken as slaves and sold to the caliphate. There are probably other, and this is also partly based on the historical information produced by Ibn Fadlan in the 10th century. He talked about this. But I don't want to go too much off or talking about Scandinavia, although it's very interesting.
I do want to mention that I noticed that you didn't have one Viking hoard or area in the UK where coins were found, and that is the Vale of York hoard.
Oh yes, yeah. Sorry, I did. Yeah, because that was discovered since I first. Yeah, so in the Vale of York, yes, we have got coins. Yeah, we have got coins from there, and there's more discovered elsewhere. That yeah. So the Vale of York, yeah, we have some very nice coins from there as well. Yeah.
Sorry, does
Yes.
the geographical spread of these discoveries of
Yeah.
Islamic coins in the UK, does that tell us anything about the exact sort of date that Muslim coinage most likely arrived in Britain?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it's interesting, and it kind of changed over time. So we've got a few different sources of coins, really. We've got we've got Iraq, let's say Mesopotamia, Iran, Islamic world, central, and that we get a lot of material from there in the early period, let's say from the 8th century. Then later on, and this is, in fact, we've got an example from number 27 here. We start getting much more material from Afghanistan, so from the Eastern Islamic world, a lot of silver. So the trading patterns are changing. And then the other thing we've got is we've also got a bit later on, again in the 11th century, we start to get material from North Africa and from Spain, and that's again a different trade route. So the earliest ones are from the Central Islamic lands, then you get them from the West and also from the Far East, but less from the center. So yeah, you can kind of, and so I think these really give an indication of sort of European circulation of coins, really, coinage. But the huge numbers of coins in the Scandinavian world is, as I say, people normally think that it's to do with the slave trade, but it could have been other things as well. And that's again something which has received quite a lot of attention, but I think again it's something which could be dealt with more. I'll just mention one thing here because I find it interesting. I mean, it's something that happened to me in relation to this. Is that a few years ago I was asked to go to a Viking conference in Sweden. And because my family's originally Danish, so I was kind of quite interested in this because I was interested in the Vikings. I don't really know that much about them, but I was sort of interested. But I couldn't quite work out why I was asked to go. But anyway, they asked me to talk about Baghdad and Islamic cities. And once I got to Stockholm, I talked about this, and they explained the reason why they wanted me to talk about this is because the two first Viking large settlements, which you could kind of call cities, were Birka, which I mentioned, which is near Stockholm, and also a place called Hedeby, which is in Schleswig-Holstein. It's in Germany now, but it's near the Danish border. And in both these cases, the settlements, which were huge, were round. And the idea of the conference organizer is that perhaps the Vikings, because we know there was Vikings visiting Baghdad and perhaps even living there. And for them, remember, Scandinavia was never conquered by the Romans. So they had no concept of, well, they must have traveled, but their idea of what a city was, a big population where people lived together. they could have taken their first ideas of urbanism from the Islamic world rather than from the Roman, British, whatever European world. So that was why it's there. And so they are, and certainly both Burqa and Heatherby have circular shapes. Whether it was inspired by Baghdad or not, I'm not sure, but it's a thing to think of. So I'd say there's more to go into there. And in fact, this brings me on to the next sort of slide. This is good that I was thinking of, which is okay. So these are some coin hoards from Britain, Curedale hoard, and with some Islamic dirhams here. And this, what I'd like to say about this, really, these are just examples. So you've got the coins, but you've also got these ingots here. And I suppose the thing to stress is, in general, in their trading with the Scandinavian parts of Britain and the rest of Scandinavia, the Vikings were interested mostly in the silver coins because of their weight. And here we see some cut Samanid from Afghanistan or Eastern Iran dirhams, which have been cut. But we've also see a set of balance scales here. And so the Viking traders, this is the traders who went into what is today Russia, Ukraine, and through the Black Sea to the Islamic world and into the Islamic world. They would have taken these balances with them. So a potential interesting thing to do, and I was asked to do this by some of the Swedish archaeologists, is to keep an eye out for scales like these. These are typical Viking scales, which they used to weigh out the silver they're offered, and which they'd use in their transactions in the Islamic world. So,
Professor, it sounds like they weren't using these coins in order to for transactions, but you mentioned that they were using them for weight. What does that exactly mean?
Okay, so it means, I suppose, if you think of, I was going to say almost any pre-modern travel, but the way that the Vikings would have reached from Scandinavia, would have reached the Middle East, would have been through the rivers, using their boats, sometimes dragging them across land where they had to, but by their boats, maybe dragging the boats across ice in the winter. But the traveling, they would have had to have had things very compact, and so they're just interested in the raw value of the metal which they could use. And so and within Scandinavia, I'd say the trading was probably less sophisticated than it was in the Islamic world, and they'd really be kind of dealing in weights rather than in the actual coins. That's not to say that they wouldn't actually be using the coins, but they weren't so bothered, and they just wanted the weight of the coins rather than because they couldn't. That's the other thing. They probably, or maybe they could. This is an interesting thing. They probably couldn't read what was written on the coins to know what their value was. Maybe they did, but yeah. So, and also is common practice actually in lots of pre-modern societies to cut coins, because I mean, I'm not a numismatist, but numismatists, coin specialists, are very familiar with this, the idea of cutting up coins, because you can make a coin. Coins are quite expensive to make, but sometimes for smaller transactions, you want half a coin or a quarter. And this is what you can kind of see here. And so what the state made, or what the rulers made, their coins were often not useful for smaller transactions, so people cut them up. So that's why, again, why you'd need the scales, because you'd want to know that you're getting good value with your money. Yeah. So yeah, so that's coinage. Now yeah, I'm just looking at this map. I'm just realizing that I made these maps a while ago, and we've kind of had more information since then. But this just indicative, really, of places where We're talking about specifically medieval Syrian pottery. So what I mean by medieval is 1200s, really, 1200s, 1300s. So kind of the time, and a bit earlier, time of what we might think of as the Crusades, from 1100s, 1200s. And these are some examples of places where pottery has been found. I should mention, from an earlier period, we've also got, from the same period, from the Abbasid period, from the 8th century and 9th century, we've got from East Anglia finds of pottery, probably from Iraq. I should have included one, but basically these jars, they're green glazed jars. They can be different sizes, and these were probably used for transporting date syrup, and they're very easily identifiable, probably from Iraq. And we found a few of these in East Anglia, in Anglo-Saxon settlements. So that's interesting, because sugar, or anything like sugar, which was date syrup, very high in calories, very and in pre-modern times, people would have paid a lot for this. So these jars are found all over the world. They've been found from the Philippines to East Anglia, so they're very widely traded. So I haven't got those on the map, but they're a bit earlier. But from the period of the Crusades, these are some places where we found some. And so this is from Wales, Grossmont Castle. And actually, this is quite interesting, because this is an example of racquerware. So actually, this is what I found in London, some of this pottery. So you can see, the photograph's not so good and it's a bit worn, but this is bright blue with black underglaze painting. So, and it's not made of, you can just see the edge here. It's very white substance, and this is this fritware. So it's a composite, artificial kind of pottery that's made. So it's very sophisticated, and it was made originally. This is invented to imitate Chinese pottery, but they kind of developed their own. But yeah, so this is from Grossmont Castle. The idea is this could have been bought back from somebody on a crusade, or I personally think these were probably traded quite widely at the time. And from London, we found there've been lots of examples of albarellos. These are these jars. They're about, jars which are used probably for medicines. And a lot of these been found in the Docklands in London, and these date to the 1300s. So that's certainly an example of trade. And then this is quite remarkable. This is called the Luck of Eden Hall. Again, it's in the British Museum. No, it's in the Victorian Albert Museum. And this is a glass beaker made in Syria, probably in the 1200s. And these are very well identified and very complex to make, I'd say, because you're using both clear see-through glass, colored glass, a sophisticated shape. And of course, the amazing thing about this is that it's actually made its way back to, this is from Cumbria. It's owned by a family in Cumbria. We don't know. We think it probably goes back to the Crusades. So this is something that would have been very well looked after and very valuable. Because of course it's glass, it's fragile, and glass in general doesn't survive that well. But there are other examples in Britain of glass. One of the issues with this glass is, if you just found a fragment, it's sometimes called Veneto-Saracenic, which means Venetian or Islamic. And there was an idea that this was maybe made in Venice, although really I think the idea is that Venice was importing these and selling them on into Europe. I think that's kind of more likely.
So you don't think that it was maybe Syrian artisans living in Venice and having them imported from? Because I remember that's one of the ideas that you had mentioned, some
Yeah,
have
well,
hypothesized.
that is actually possible. Yeah, no, that certainly is possible, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing, and that's one of the things that, yeah, people don't think about enough, and that's very tantalizing, really. That's really tantalizing, the actual presence of people within, say, Europe and within Britain. I'll just mention at this point two things to do with Europe, because I think when you talk about the archaeology of Islam in Britain, you have to talk about Europe as well. I mean, I'd say, I'm saying a bit about what I think about the present, but I think you can't separate Britain from Europe, I don't think. And
Right.
I think, but let's say at the time that you've got the Offa's dinar, for example, 8th century. 8th century, we've got in France, we've got in southern France, in Nîmes, there's an excavation of a cemetery, which seemed to be warriors. Most of the warriors seemed to be Christian, but two of them were Muslim. We know that from the positioning and also from DNA analysis of the burials, so that we know that these people were genetically Arab and Berber. So we know there were Muslim warriors in southern France, but intriguingly, and I need to get the exact reference of a colleague of mine who's an historian of Norman Britain and Normandy in France. He's found a reference to, I think it's William II employing Saracen troops in Normandy for fighting in Normandy,
Wow.
which is really tantalizing. And that's just a small ref, because his speciality is finance records, and that's how he found it. It's not anywhere else. And he knows the place that they're serving. So again, that would be interesting to look at. I mean, how you actually, again, it's something that people could actually look at. And of course, Normandy's quite close to Britain. That's from a later period, of course. That's from the when is it? William Rufus. That's from the 12th century. But again, there's all these tantalizing things. This idea of maybe you actually did have Muslims living in Britain, or certainly in Europe. We know they probably were. So, but where exactly? And also the other thing to remember, of course, is that Spain really had a Muslim presence right into the end of the 15th century, 1400s. So Spain's not that close from not that far from France. So I think there would have been more familiarity than you get from the documents, really, I'd say.
I suppose this must be really difficult, but how
Yeah.
difficult is it to distinguish between like a piece of glassware that was made in the Islamic world and then brought back, or a piece of glassware that was made in Europe but inspired by Islamic techniques?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's quite a technical question, and quite, yeah, and it's interesting. First of all, I'd say it's possible. It is possible, but it's also quite difficult because within archaeometry, that's the scientific study of materials in archaeology. It's quite sophisticated, and in particular, glass, surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, anyway, glass is actually one of the most areas where there's kind of been the most research, most advanced research. And so, yes, it is, to a certain extent, it should be possible. The problem is with when you're making glass is there's glass and glaze, but it depends on the kind of materials. So glass is made from kind of silica, but it also needs some other materials, and sometimes it needs potash, which can be derived from plants. So that's why Syria had the right type of plants growing to produce this. But there's also the question of whether people actually imported the material from Syria into Venice, for example, to use there. Because one of the very noticeable things about glass, and I found this out quite early when I was working in Oman, is that you sometimes get in archaeological sites, you get small pieces of glass, say they look like this, broken bits. They're not like vessels, but they're actually, what happens is glass, once glass is made, it tends to get reused over and over again. You just melt it down and reform it. It gradually gets more, but so that's one of the problems. So it's possible, but it's difficult. That's the answer. Yeah. So, yeah. So yeah. So yeah. Just going on from yeah. This is really talking about Spanish pottery found within Britain. Lots of sites, much more than I've got here actually. Now, this is an interesting thing because this is most of this pottery is from places which is technically taken over, recaptured, or depending on your view, by Christians in Spain, because we have the Reconquista of Spain, where Spain, Andalus, was gradually the Muslim Spain was reduced, and the people were conquering it from the north. And there's lots in the literature about this. But the potters, we think probably a lot of the people actually doing making the pottery were still Muslim. So, and I'd say this is, yeah, one of the things that's quite interesting is you get the rulers of a particular area and the actual people, and the belief systems of the two may be different. So, for example, in the reconquered areas of Spain, I'd say probably a lot of the people were still Muslim at this time. So these finds of pottery were probably produced. The techniques are identical from, so we think these were probably produced by Muslim potters in what is Christian Spain. Yeah.
And how did they make their way to the British?
Yeah. So this would have been trade networks. So you can see there's a clustering around, say, Bristol, London, ports, basically. But this is a seaborne trade from the west as well. So you can see a lot more in Ireland and Bristol. So but again, I think, okay, I think what this says is that the pottery that you get from the Islamic world, and which you can now get from people you could trade with, was in Christian Spain, was highly valued because technically it was much better, is much better. Technically, in terms of, because glaze basically is to keep pottery clean so you can wash it and you can reuse it for food, is much better. And lead glaze is not really that good. It doesn't look that good, and it's quite hard to do. Whereas the tin glazes, and Spain had a lot of tin glazes, tin opacified glazes, which was produced in Spain, both looked better and actually functioned much better. And there they also produced in Spain maiolica, which is this like fritware as well. Again, this artificial paste which made the pottery lighter as well. That's the other thing, is much lighter, much nicer thing to use, really. So there's a big demand for Islamic pottery in Britain in the medieval times. Yeah. And if you look at, and there's only really, I'd say, from after the 16th century that you started getting better pottery made in Britain, non-glaze, better quality. Yeah. So just moving on, this is this is 18th century. So this is we're talking about something slightly different here, but when I was talking about actual people existing in Britain, Muslims, there's a question of like identity, I suppose, about how people thought of different people. And sometimes you have the idea that these people are seen as other, and there's the idea of Orientalism and like making people seem different and more strange and more alien than they need to be. But I mean, I suppose what this shows is that certainly Turkish people were kind of quite familiar, and the idea of Turks were quite familiar within Britain. And so, yeah, actually, this is a bit like a transition point to what I'm talking about. I'm coming into like from the 16th century onwards, 1500s. I'd say you get an acceleration in the contact with the Islamic world, or even if it's not maybe there's more before, but we're not aware of it. But from the 16th century, you know a lot more. And this is both in terms of historical sources and in terms of archaeology. A big reason for this is Henry VIII, really, because Henry VIII split Britain off from the Catholic Church for his own reasons. For his own reasons. He decided that Britain didn't need to be part of it, and he made a lot of money out of that. He was able to take all the church's properties, things like that. But it also meant that Britain was, in a sense, isolated within Europe. And so from that point onwards, and it goes up and down, you get Britain having alliances with various Muslim states, but mostly the Ottoman Empire, which is seen as the biggest Muslim state. And also in the 16th century, it was incredibly powerful and is the richest state in the area. So Henry VIII.
Yeah, looking into Marmaduke Pickthall's biography, I was quite surprised that in his time, Brits had a very favorable opinion of the Turks. Of course, that changed later on, but as he was coming up, Britain and the Ottoman Empire, were very cordial with each other.
Yeah. That really is the case, and it's I'm actually gonna just a bit later on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this relationship with you're right. From the 1500s, it was a really big thing. And I'll just show you two examples of something. Well, anyway, these are not anyway. Here's a 16th century cannon, and I suppose, and it's from Horse Guards Parade in London. So it's right at the centre of British national life. And there's a plaque on it that says it's a Turkish gun, and here's the information about it, made by Murad, son of Abdullah, in 1524 and taken in Egypt by the British Army in 1801. So this was a really, so this is a piece of Ottoman weaponry that was, or armaments, that was seen as highly desirable and was taken, I think it was actually a gift of the Turkish commanders, because I think at that stage, I mean, it changed many times. At that stage, we were on the same side as the Turks fighting the French. So this is one I've talked about this is another one which is just interesting, and this is an Ottoman gun from much later, 1790s. This was actually captured, but again, to show that there's an Ottoman presence, again, something you can kind of look at in terms of guns. And if anybody's interested in doing research, I think there's more to be got out of this. If you went to the Royal Armouries in Leeds, there's a lot more that could be kind of looked at. So I'm going to say a bit more about the kind of Ottoman Empire a bit later on, but now I'd like to talk a little bit. Yeah, well, this is about, anyway, I'm going to talk about Kew Gardens, where so you may be aware of this idea of follies, people building follies, interesting buildings. And so in the 1700s, there's a big fashion towards building gardens and decorating these with pavilions. And so here you've got a drawing of a mosque and the Alhambra, which were built in Kew Gardens. And this is just to show the location, so you can see of them within the plan of the gardens at Kew, built in 1763. So there's a mosque down here and that copy of the Alhambra there. This is the site today. The mosque, both of them were demolished, but potentially it's a site that could be looked at. And of course, as an archaeologist, I can't help but be interested in what it actually looked like, seeing if there's anything there. And there are a couple of other sites like this in Britain, where you have maybe mosques which are built kind of temporarily. There was, for example, in Bradford, in one of the exhibitions there in the 19th century, there's a site of a mosque which could usefully be looked at. So there's things like this. So we're looking at actually targeting physical spaces.
But those previous mosques,
Yeah.
were they functional? Did people, what
Yeah,
was
were
the
they
purpose of them being built?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the idea is that they weren't they weren't functioning. But I wonder, that's all. I wonder, because if you think of 1700s, 1760s, there would have been quite a lot of contact with India also. So these weren't built as functioning mosques, but you know, I personally think maybe people, yeah, they weren't built as mosques, no. And but they certainly kind of gave the idea, and maybe they could have been, but certainly they're mostly a representation of, I think, the wider world. I think that's kind of the idea. The Alhambra that was there is, I think, as a symbol of the pinnacle, because it's often regarded as the most perfect Islamic building, I suppose, one of the most perfect buildings. So that was function there. The mosque, I think, is really representing. And you've got to look at the politics of the time. I think I'll just go back. Is really representing. I'd say that's based on an Ottoman mosque, and it's based on the idea of contacts, kind of, with the Ottoman world, which at that stage, I mean, our relations with the Ottoman world went up, with the Ottoman Empire went up and down, but in general, over 400 years, Britain's relationship with the Ottoman Empire was mostly quite good. So I think it's kind of perhaps a form of education, really. Yeah.
I mean, were they sort of Qibla orientated, or do we have any details like that?
Well, I think the mihrab was in the. Well, this is what we don't know. From what I've read, the mihrab was like was not there wasn't a mihrab inside this one. It was maybe visible on the outside. But actually, we don't know. I mean, I think that's why it might be worth actually looking. I haven't actually checked. That's one thing I probably should have done. I haven't actually checked that. But yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, I don't know, because if it was, it would suggest it could have been used. Yeah, and actually thinking about it now, in terms of as a function, I mean, it reminds me of these festival mosques, for example. You know, perhaps Kew Gardens could have been an ideal place for a gathering of Muslims, and then a mosque like this could have, a building like this could have formed a focus. That's actually an interesting thing that, again, worth thinking about. Yeah. So, hang on. Yeah. So, hang on. So now I'm just going to come to an actual mosque. So this is probably quite well known to a lot of Muslims, or should be known to a lot of Muslims in Britain.
You definitely see this picture, or you definitely see this mosque used a lot pertaining to British Islam, without it being named, because I used to see it numerous times in thumbnails, other publications, different flyers that Muslims might use. But I never knew the history behind it until actually watching your lecture, and then doing a bit of my own research and finding old newsreels about different gatherings at this mosque, including its founding.
Yeah, so I think this is a really kind of fascinating building, and really interesting for the kind of it says a lot about British relationship with Islam and what it can be and what it has been, and also culture, and also says a lot about like kind of I'd say it says a lot about the cosmopolitan nature of Britain in the 19th century. I think Britain was much more cosmopolitan than people kind of think, because there has been an idea that Victorian Britain was very well, very imperial, very strict, very controlled, whereas I think actually it was very cosmopolitan and not possibly more chaotic, more going on than people think. So, okay, this mosque was founded by somebody called William Gottlieb, which is interesting. Wilhelm, not a Muslim,
Yeah, I
but
was surprised to
Hungarian.
find he was a Hungarian Jew.
Yeah, yeah, Hungarian Jew, which is kind of very interesting. And he taught at a college in Lahore, in what is today Pakistan. He knew 15 languages, an amazing person. And he had this, and this probably needs a bit more thinking about. He decided he wanted to set up an Oriental Institute to study languages, Oriental languages in Britain, in somewhere near London, which is interesting in itself because he was Hungarian, you know, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he decided that London was the place to do it. Why? I mean, many reasons probably. So he set up an Oriental Institute in 1883, and the mosque was built in 1889. Architecturally, I'll just say, well, I can say a few things. Architecturally, it's interesting because it looks like an Indian mosque. The money came from, because even though he's probably reasonably wealthy, he didn't have enough money to build the mosque. So it was funded by Shah Jahan, who is a Muslim ruler in Bhopal in India, what is today India. Architecturally, the building looks kind of a bit Indian. So these things on the corners, chaptries, these derive ultimately from Hindu temple architecture, but they were kind of very normal in Mughal architecture. This is what do you call it? Indian Islamic architecture. The dome is a general symbol of, I suppose, Islamic architecture. They've got interesting arches here. But the other thing that's worth pointing out is these stepped features, like crenellations or merlons, we call them. And these are really interesting because these really date right back to early Islamic architecture from the Middle East. So even though this is an Indian Islamic building with Indian features from Hindu architecture, it's also got things from the Middle East. Now, whether that was a conscious move or not, I'm not quite sure. It probably was, actually, because it's the idea of it's internationally Islamic, I suppose, if you're going to be in London. My photographs of this are not that good because I only had a phone with me at the time when I went there. But this is the interior. Yeah, one of the interesting things for me is the interior. It's quite small inside. That's what's quite interesting.
Well, I'm sure they probably didn't have too many people frequenting. Well, I don't know. Did they have a
Well,
lot of people
yeah, they
frequenting the
did.
mosque?
They did. They had a lot of people going there, and I think they got more and more people going there. And I mean, I think again, there's this thing that, like the mosque, you don't actually have to pray in a mosque, I suppose. So the mosque symbolically is quite good if you're working there and you're day in, day out. But if you have more numbers, I suppose you can kind of pray in the main building, I suppose. Because the main building, there's also another building there, the actual Oriental Institute was converted from something else. And that probably was, people probably used that as well. But the mosque, again, could have provided the directionality. And so, yeah, it's interesting that it's small, yet highly decorated, very expensive to build. Interestingly, in terms of politics, the mosque was disused around the time of the First World War. I think this is partly because of Gottlieb being Hungarian, and the Hungarians were on the wrong side in the war. And so I think that's probably connected with that. But then, yeah, but it's culturally, it's kind of, yeah, but extremely important. One thing I'd like to mention here, because you'll find it if you look up about mosques, and it's worth knowing about. There's also a very old established Yemeni community in Cardiff. And they're Muslims, and they also claim to have the first mosque in Britain, but it wasn't purpose built, it was kind of converted. But the date of the foundation of that mosque is not quite clear. I mean, I did today, it's in the docks in Cardiff. I visited it before they rebuilt it, and that was interesting because that was a maybe a community hall which had been repurposed, and they'd just put markers, carpets out to indicate the Qibla, and they'd put a mihrab in, which is kind of quite interesting. But so that wasn't a purpose-built mosque, but possibly that was they had Muslims, large numbers of Muslims using a mosque earlier in Cardiff than they did in London. But that's maybe my prejudice. That's again something to kind of look at. Now, yeah, sorry. This is a thing which I mentioned to you before, but it's quite. We're talking about the Ottoman Empire, and in my other research, because I'm quite interested in Islamic burial in general and archaeology of Islam burial and how it can be carried out. So I became quite interested in this naval cemetery in Portsmouth. And this is a cemetery, you can see a view of it. And so most of the people buried here are people who are in the Royal Navy. But in one corner you get this, which is a cemetery of Turkish sailors who came here in 1850 on a ship, the the Ottoman Sultan, and they're here to do. I think they're actually delivering material for an exhibition. But 21 of the sailors died because the ship was here for a long time, and they're buried in the cemetery at Haslar Hospital. Now, this isn't actually Haslar Hospital. This is a different place. So in the 1880s, the hospital closed its cemetery, and the remains were disinterred, and then they were later reinterred here in this cemetery in Portsmouth. And this is you can probably just about see it. This is one of the original gravestones for the people who died there. So this really says a lot about British Ottoman naval cooperation in the 19th century. There's a lot. Britain, basically, the Ottoman Navy was really a collaborative endeavor between British personnel and the Ottoman Navy. So the Ottomans had some of the first steamships, naval steamships, first ironclad steamships, in advance of other countries, because Britain was the foremost naval power at the time, and so Britain did a lot of work and training of Turkish troops. And I've been reading a lot of the accounts, and the relationship between the British and the Turks was very good at the time. And now this is one other gravestone there, which doesn't actually fit in. And this is from 1879. And I've looked at newspaper reports of this, and this is from the remains of Adjutant Major Abdullah Effendi. And he was the military attaché at the Turkish embassy, and he was killed because his horse threw him off when he was in the Horse Guards parade, and he's killed. And this is in 1879, and so he died. And given the idea that you should be buried as soon as possible in Muslim Muslim custom. The idea was, where could he be buried? So they had to think quite quickly. So they decided on burying him in the only well-known Muslim cemetery at the time, was this one in Portsmouth. So there's a huge funeral for him, attended by lots of very famous people. And this was actually very much a society event. I mean, we've got a newspaper accounts of this, and this was like regarded as like a major event of an important Muslim Ottoman official who died in London. And I've got a huge report here. So that's something that's quite interesting there, because I think it's interesting that it was decided that this was important, that he got buried here. And today, those new gravestones, which you saw in the earlier picture, they're all provided by the Turkish embassy in London. And so this is, and in 1985, this was classified as a war memorial cemetery. So it's got that status. But one thing in terms of actual archaeology, which is quite interesting, that in recent years, about 8 years ago, there are more excavations carried out at the original site of Haslar Hospital, and they found a number of burials which they thought might also be Muslims. Now, the excavation was carried out because it's still Ministry of Defence. And so that's something, again, which we need to look at, because I haven't actually been able to look at the records, but there may be more Muslims. I think there probably were that are in that, which need to be studied anyway. But that's archaeology, by the way, takes a long time for the analysis. So that's why we don't know for certain yet. But that's, again, something that's interesting. Okay, that's I'll skip that, because that's Leighton House, by the way, which is an important centre. But I'm going to skip now, because I'm sort of slightly conscious. I've been going on a bit, but I'd like to talk about this building, and I'd like to ask, because yes, first time you've seen it, we'd like to ask you if you recognise this building, or what you think it might be.
You know, by looking on the outside, especially the design on the window, it looks very Islamic. But then when I look closer and I see the Hebrew writing,
it's
there's
not
something there's something obviously Jewish about it. So it seems like something that is blended two cultures into each other.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And yeah, I'll just show you some of the Islamic features on it. Yeah, you can see them kind of here, the details. And I'd say, yeah, this is a really interesting building. And so this was built in 1880, and it's one of the first Reform synagogues built in Britain. Now, that, as far as I understand it, the Reform Judaism started in Germany, and there's a community of German Jews this is in Bradford, by the way. Sorry, I forgot to say, this is in Bradford, built in 1880 by Dr. Joseph Strauss. And I think what's interesting is that this building was built, he wanted to build a synagogue. He had the money, they were wealthy. They traded in wool, mostly textiles. Bradford was very important for sheep wool at the time. And the idea was he wanted to build a synagogue, but kind of didn't know what to do, because this was the first Reformed synagogue. There were some synagogues in Britain already, but he wanted to do something that was kind of different. And well, the main thing actually was that he didn't want to build a synagogue that looked like a church or a chapel, because in his mind, the Jewish experience in Europe had been one of persecution, and he didn't like Gothic architecture. And so he thought, well, where did Jews get on best? Where was their most flourishing time? Where we got the best? So he decided to use Islamic architecture. This is a conscious decision. So this building basically, and the architect was given instructions, and so all of this is borrowed from Islamic architecture. So, and again, like the Woking Mosque, it's got elements from different parts of the Islamic world. So it's got this striped, this kind of red and white look, which is ultimately derived from Syria, Mamluk
I was going to say
architecture.
Spain. It reminds me of the
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right, and also
uh,
Spain, yes.
not the Alhambra Palace, but the is it the mosque in Cordoba? You
Yeah,
always see
Cordoba Mosque, yeah,
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 the
yeah.
Cordoba
So,
Mosque.
it derives from that, and it's also got. If you look at the top here, along the top, these kind of like puppet figures almost along the top where the roof is.
Mhm.
That's something which we find in in Egyptian architecture, Egyptian Islamic architecture. So they've used various, and this actually, the last time I went there, the building was closed. I'd like to go again, but it's interesting that this is also continued inside as well. So this kind of, and so this was the architectural vocabulary that was used at the time. So I think that's kind of that's kind of quite interesting that you have that. So, and again, if we think of the Shah Jahan Mosque built by a Hungarian Jewish person, you can see up until in the 19th century, these were the friends, these were the closest culturally. These regarded each other as kind of supported. And then if you think again of Spain, the Reconquista, which is often perceived as, well, I think possibly differently now, but the idea used to be in European history, this is the great reconquest of Muslims. This is civilization coming back to Spain, even though whatever. But what's interesting is that that's also the time of the expulsion of both the Jews and the Muslims from Spain. Some went to South America, to the New World, but a lot went to the Ottoman Empire. And so you get the complex, or rather quite different trajectory of Jewish and Muslim life, culture within the Ottoman Empire, which is again kind of quite interesting. But yeah, so that's kind of, I think for me, I'd say what all this shows, there's been prolonged, sustained contact, which we can kind of demonstrate through the material culture. There's been an awareness, and I think by doing more work like this, you can probably find more. I think there's more information to be gained, and I think it can kind of it can be used to give a more positive or fuller picture of this Britain's relationship with Islam.
Definitely, because
Yeah.
like I mentioned throughout this talk, I didn't know about any of this before I watched your lecture. I might have heard about the Ofa coin, and I was under the assumption that he was Muslim. But after watching your lecture, it just opened me up to a whole new world of hypothesis about coinage, wares, architecture from just to demonstrate what Islamic architecture is about to a non-Muslim British culture to developing a purpose-built mosque in order to serve Muslims. And from what I've talked to you about
Yeah.
previously,
Yeah.
it wasn't like the Woking Mosque that we just talked about. It
Yeah.
wasn't, even though it was to serve Muslims, many non-Muslims frequented that mosque who were
Yeah.
celebrities, well-to-do members of British society. And, it just really opened my eyes up to maybe how Islam was perceived during that period compared to how Muslims and Islam are seen today in not only
Yeah.
Britain, but in many European countries.
Yeah. No, that's really, really good point. I mean, I think it's interesting that yeah, I mean, particularly in the Victorian period. I mean, I was going to add it, but I didn't. But one of the things that's quite interesting, for example, I mean, I think Well, I'll just take two personalities. This is something I'm working on. It's a historical thing, but I'm thinking about it at the moment. You've got, let's say, Sir Richard Burton, not the actor, not the Welsh actor, but the famous
Translator of the Kama Sutra. Many people might know him.
Okay, yeah. The famous Richard Burton, and he kind of, he was like very Victorian, but also he kind of didn't fit into society. He did and he didn't, and he famously made a pilgrimage to Mecca when he wasn't Muslim. But then again, the question is, well, or was he? That's the question. And I think that's another thing which we need to think about more as well, is this idea of hybrid identities. Because I mean, he's actually buried, and this is a thing that I should encourage people to go and look at. He's buried in a cemetery in London in a Catholic church, but his tomb is built in the shape of a Bedouin tent. So this really meant kind of a lot to him. And his wife they used to have seance meetings in this tomb afterwards, like his followers and stuff. So there's some of this reminds me a bit of Sufi type practices, things like that. And there's just one other person I'd like to mention, because I think he's really interesting, is a person called Rustam Pasha. Now, who may well have met Richard Burton, because he was the Ottoman governor of Syria in the around the same period, 1870s, and he went there because there's some problems. And he's the first he's the Ottoman governor of Lebanon, because the idea is he was fully Ottoman, but also he had to be not Muslim, so he was Catholic. But the British were very in favor of him, and he was governor of Lebanon. And then he became the Ottoman ambassador to London, to England. And he wrote loads of stuff supporting Islam in the British newspapers everywhere. And he's always supporting Muslims. And yet he was an Italian Catholic. And he's again buried in London. So it's an interesting thing. So I think you know, I think the way things are now is not the natural state of affairs.
You know, I feel very motivated to hear that, you know, because it means that there's still a possibility of maybe taking things back to its natural state of affairs, you know, absent of the last maybe 70 years, which I wouldn't say were entirely bad, but there was it's a mixed bag of good and negative.
And also maybe how you know, these stories or these theories about these figures might revitalize our understanding of Islam in Britain and how it can be lived in that sense. In particular, there's a lot of like popular theories that are shared a lot about sort of submarine converts. This idea that there were some very famous figures who were secretly Muslim but never overt about it in public. So that story about Richard Burton is incredibly interesting.
Well, you know, there's that story about Richard Stanley, and I'm friends with one of his relatives on Facebook, and she popularizes his biography a lot. Was that, you know, he was Muslim. He converted to Islam later in his life, but his family his family later on had no idea that he converted to Islam until one of the family members did some research into the family history, and it just came up. So I believe there is a possibility that there might have been some submarines out there.
Yeah, I think there are probably quite a lot, actually, quite a lot, because I mean, there's I can't remember her name. There's a famous English aristocratic, she's Scottish woman who's buried in the Highlands somewhere with a Muslim burial. She's quite famous. I've forgotten her name, but the one that I think is really interesting, not British, but is he kind of operated from Britain, is the person who discovered Petra.
I'm trying to think of
Swiss, Burckhardt.
Yeah, Johann Burckhardt.
Johann Burckhardt. Now, his family, I think, possibly still insist that he never converted to Islam, yet he's actually buried in a Muslim cemetery in Cairo. which to me kind of
Undermines that
indicates.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we do just have a few concluding
Yes.
questions,
Yeah. Yeah.
if you don't mind, that
Yeah. That's good.
have to
Yeah.
do with the lecture that you gave. I
Yeah.
mean, you mentioned numerous times that by looking at material culture, sometimes you get a different story than what you might find in documents, judging from the artifacts and architecture found in Britain. Whether they journeyed from the Islamic world or were created in Europe but inspired by the Islamic culture, what do they tell us about how Islam was perceived in British culture until recent times? How would you
Um,
interpret all of this material?
okay. Okay. I'd say one thing is that there's a um, maybe there's this Orientalism. I think this Oriental idea that, and I say possibly to a certain extent, yeah, there's this idea that it's different and that it represents luxury. It represents something that's interesting. But I'd also have to say, and this is something you can only really understand from being in Britain, it probably represents warmth as well, warm weather, and like kind of a different lifestyle, it's kind of different way of, different approach to life. So there's that. And then the other thing I think that's probably worth saying, and this relates to this Shah Jahan Mosque as well, is that we talked about the Ottomans as well, but it's like Britain's relationship with, I'd say India, but the Indian subcontinent, whatever you call it, India, Greater India, let's say, South Asia, is that's the other thing, is that Islam is also kind of that's been a way that a lot of people have encountered people who otherwise wouldn't encounter Muslims. That's been their first kind of acquaintance with Islamic world, and I think so. In a lot of people, and then you think of, say, the what's it called, the pavilion in Brighton Pavilion, which on the outside looks like a Mughal building. And then that's again, people, I think in many people's mind, there's this kind of confusion, perhaps. I'm talking about people who aren't particularly interested, between Islamic and Indian and South Asia. So I think there's a lot of like kind of confusion there. And that's something that kind of would something that could be thought about and maybe worked on in some way.
Mm.
And just one other thing is I read a book that was I didn't read it in the 1930s. It's written in the 1930s, and it said that the British Empire, which is at its biggest ever then, had like most of the Muslims in the world. So I think that's
Under their rule. That's something
yeah.
I've never
Yeah.
thought about myself.
Yeah.
This
And
contact.
yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so for me, and I think Britain's relationship was very good, actually, was very good, and I think it's just something that needs to be remembered.
One thing that I wanted to ask is, you sort of separated the artifacts that you showed us into sort of three sort of categories. We had sort of coinage at the beginning, and then ceramics and architecture.
Yeah.
And these all sort of connect to different periods in history.
Yeah.
What does the fact that these different artifacts connect to different periods tell us about the sort of evolutionary nature and dynamic nature of Islamic and British culture?
Okay, yeah, good. That's very good, actually. That's a very good, interesting question, because it's made me, because I think a lot of this relates to Britain's relationship to Europe and the wider world. And Britain, because of being an island, obviously the navy, the ocean has become important, but that only really, well, again, you go back to Henry VIII, everything goes back to, but Henry VIII created the British Navy, but really from around that time, so before that, we'd been kind of like, I'd say, kind of passive recipients of just kind of like at the end of the line, because we're far northwest of Europe, and some kind of contact with the Islamic world. But then from the 1500s and really in the 1700s, the seaborne empire, you know, India, Africa, this huge empire, which gave to some people like much more direct contact, very direct contact with people, you know, thousands of miles away. I think that really, so the change really was, I think, this far-flung empire, this and this relationship which was carried out over thousands of miles at a time when transport was, I suppose, quite slow compared with today. So I think the relationship with the people had, they were aware of all of these places around the world, all these different people, and also began to piece together a concept of the globe, the global community, in which you had, let's say, West African Muslims, and you had people in India and Sri Lanka and Malaysia, and all of this, I think, and I think that's one of the things. But I think it's to do with Britain's trading links, and also I think I'd say it's also like, and again, something I think people need to think about is Britain's sort of inclusive cosmopolitan nature from that time onwards, and I think that's something that's worth, you know, keeping with, really.
And how does the study of Islamic archaeology in Britain connect with broader research in Islamic archaeology globally? And what insights can be gained from comparing findings across different regions? Because you were like to more or less doing that, especially early on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, obviously, with things like coins and stuff, things like coins, we can trace coins from that are from here, so we can trace those back. And I think well, one thing is again really looking in detail at the a lot of this literature from Britain, archaeological literature, to actually look for these kind of links to the Islamic world. And then the other thing, looking abroad, I think that's really interesting. Like, as I say, I'd like to look at that in the forest in France, in Normandy, but also specifically, and this comes back to my other interest of Islamic burials, starting to look at DNA as well, and things like we've got the burials in France. I mean, who knows? There might be some in Britain, but just looking at things like that, and also I'd say looking at actually really looking in places like Iraq, actually, and looking at to see if we can find any traces of British European material culture that may have kind of made their way there. There hasn't been found so far, but that's just, I'd say, because it hasn't been looked for particularly. I mean, what the Swedish people told me is to look for those scales that I showed you earlier on. If we found some of those, it'd be great. But I think we might be able to do something through DNA of people within Iraq, for example, because judging by the number of slaves which have been calculated to have been taken from Europe, and also the possibility of Scandinavians, slave traders who were maybe living in Iraq, that's something to look at. But also, I'd say the other really good, interesting area is I just came across it by accident in Estonia. As I just looking at some of the public archaeology publications, and they've got they found quite a lot. That beaker that I showed you, the Luck of Eden Hall, that beaker, Syrian glass, they found a lot of that in Estonia. How did that get there? I don't know, but
right, and way farther out than Britain. to be
Yeah,
honest.
yeah. And there's this thing, and this is a tangent, but it's something that worth thinking about and looking at is, okay, there's the Hanseatic League, which in the late medieval period controlled a lot of the trade in the Baltic. And London was somehow kind of involved in this, but I think they're also trading with the Islamic world, and they had ports like Tallinn in Estonia and other places. So I think that's another thing, to maybe look at their records and also look at some of the material culture that you could kind of find in these areas, these places.
And what further research would you like to see occur in the study of a sort of Islamic material culture in Britain? How do you think that research would deepen our understanding of the historical relationship between Britain and Islam, and why do you think that's important?
Okay, so I'd say first of all, I'd say there's within further research really is like looking at archaeological records already processed. There has been, I should say, somebody's already done research on material in British museums in Britain, not the British museums in Britain, Islamic stuff there, and they found quite a lot. But that's come to Britain through a variety of methods. So it could have been trade, it could have been from the Crusades, it could have been bought. So these are things that you found there, but generally not actually excavated. So there's that. And then there's I'd say there's looking actually at a bit more detail at what pottery imports there have been. And then I'd say really I'd say there's a few places where there've been, yeah, I know the one thing that's very interesting, which would be there are a number of coffee shops in Britain. Now we know from documents and from discussions they talked about coffee. They've talked about it being the Turkish drink, the Turkish beverage. So we know that there were coffee shops. Now the site of these coffee shops we kind of know, but so they could be looked into, and it's quite possible that we might actually find some material, and the material culture would be interesting because when coffee, I presume, I don't know, and this is why you need archaeology. I don't know, but I presume that the first Turkish coffee shops, they served you coffee in like Turkish coffee cups, I would think, or maybe they didn't. We don't know, but actually how that happened is something which can be investigated, and something which could be investigated. And in fact, that whole coffee trade, to me, is a real key into understanding the relationship between the Islamic Ottoman world and Europe. Because the way I understand it, that coffee was, if you look at the origins of coffee, it just suddenly sprang into the world. And I think it came, well, I know it came through the Ottoman world where it's cultivated, jealously guarded, but it suddenly became a drink. And I think it's to do with how you roast it and the idea of making it that you can travel huge distances. I think that's what the Italians probably managed, the export of it. But yeah, so I think certainly coffee and the use and the customs associated with coffee in Britain is something that's really worth looking into and would repay work.
I would like to add before we conclude
Yeah.
the rest of this discussion was, and you mentioned it in your lecture that you gave on this very topic in 2012, was Turkish baths in the UK. We have a bathhouse here in Manchester, Victoria Baths, which has a Turkish bath in it. I would be interested in seeing what the historical context behind the development of those.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I just forgotten to mention it. Yeah, and that's actually a really, really big thing. Yeah. Well, there's Turkish baths in Britain, in Portobello in Scotland. Yeah, we've got lots of Turkish baths, but the origin, we know that for example, Henry VIII again, he had a Turkish bath in St. James's Palace.
Mm.
And we know, but I'd like to actually see the kind of evidence for that. But yeah, the idea of washing and the idea of Turkish baths is certainly something which I think is could be investigated a lot more. And the popularity of bathing, I think it owes a lot to the relationship with the Ottoman world and the Islamic world. Yeah.
All right. And, thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your research and presentation. Is there anything that you would like to mention before we conclude with the rest of this podcast?
No, well, the only thing is, I'd say as an area to look at, the material remains of Muslims or relationships with Muslims within Britain is something which really could replay quite a lot, because as I say, the work that I've done, I've just skimmed over the surface really, but I think there's a lot there, and by focusing on certain things, for example, the Cardiff community, and also in Liverpool, looking there, and also in London, I think there's more that could be got out of this. And I should just mention one other thing, is that within archaeology, as I say, when you talk about archaeology, you often think about ancient Egypt and things like this, or ancient cavemen or ancient stuff. But archaeology is a discipline, particularly in Britain. We're looking at also like much more recent times. There's a journal for contemporary archaeology. So I think there's also scope, and if you look at the way it's done in Australia, there's also scope for looking at the material culture of Muslim communities in Britain. For example, the Yemenis and Somalis in Cardiff and in Newcastle. I think that's quite a rich area to look at. In terms of Muslim culture.
Yeah, because it seems like after a certain time, a whole bunch of Islamic institutions, mosques, buildings for certain purposes just sprang up. And finding out the historical context behind the building of the construction of some of these buildings, I believe would be extremely interesting. Because it credit Asian Muslims specifically for, providing a lot of places of worship that didn't exist before a large Asian presence came to the UK. I know Somalis, being that my wife is Somali, thanks. I hear a lot of Somalis always thanking Asian Muslims for establishing certain institutions in the UK, whereas they didn't have them before. And you've talked about this as well pertaining to the Yemenis. You also mentioned Somalis in your previous lecture.
Yeah.
But just that right there would be seems like a very interesting area of study.
Yeah. I think so. And as you say, the kind of, and also there's a lot of interest that you could do, a lot of like useful work you could do at looking at, because of course people when you go to a new country, first of all, you don't build a mosque straight away because it's expensive and you're basically preoccupied. But that's the other thing, is I think within that is also to look at temporary structures or adaptive reuse of old structures for mosques again. And then again, burials is worth looking at. Yeah.
And because you mentioned burial so much, I think that might be the next, if you're up to it might be the next topic we bring you on for, because you're definitely cultivating an interest in that area within myself. So
good, great. Yeah.
All right. Well, Professor Petersen, thank you for your time. It's always really nice to talk to you on camera and off camera. I really hope more people inquire your work, and I pray that you get the funding to be able to go and excavate more areas, not only within Britain, but in other areas of Europe. I know that you do travel frequently to the Middle East to do a lot of excavations, so you're probably not short of any work in that area. But just for Muslims within a Western context, I would like to see more archaeology of Islam in Europe happening, in order to not necessarily create new narratives, but to have people think about what possibly could have been or what could be.
Yeah.
bring our situation today.
I could, yeah, actually, maybe I'll send it to you, but I've got a poster. I don't know if I can get it up now, but I got a poster about a project on Muslim Europe. So maybe, I don't know, I'll get it to you afterwards, but
Okay, please.
it just shows, it gives you an idea of the range. There's, yeah, yeah, okay.
All right. Well, again, thank you for talking to us. Your work
Okay.
is very exciting to hear.
Okay, cool.
We can't wait to see what else you got coming up next.
Okay, that's great. Anyway, it was nice to talk to you. Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much for your
Okay.
time.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, bye.